Lucas, a 64-year-old American man, had spent almost his entire life buried in a drab office, a small cubicle lost among the towering high-rises of the city. His life flowed on, quiet and predictable, like a clock wound up and set on a single path. Every day he woke up at the same hour, put on the same kind of shirt, and commuted to the same place. Lucas was the quintessential American man, someone who believed with absolute certainty in the formula for success that society had laid out for him: work hard, save every dime, and then, at 65, retire just like everyone else. He always believed that 65 was a milestone, a sweet destination after a long 40-year journey of dedication. In his mind, after walking out of that office for the very last time, he would have plenty of healthy years to enjoy. Images of a leisurely retirement were a constant presence in his thoughts: an early morning fishing trip, afternoons sipping coffee on his porch, or simply sitting and playing with his grandkids. Lucas always told himself that he had worked his entire life and now he deserved to rest. He had fulfilled his duties as a man, a father, and it was finally time to dedicate himself to his own well-being. He was certain that after 4 decades of work, his body and mind would be flexible enough to travel, to live the full life he had put on hold for so long. But as the narrator, I could clearly see the confidence, even a touch of naivety, in Lucas's thinking. He thought that if he had enough money, he would have everything. Health for him was a given, a gift that would always be there when he needed it. He didn't pay attention to the small signals his body was sending him: the persistent backache or the mornings he woke up feeling drained and listless. To Lucas, these were just signs of aging, nothing to be concerned about. He believed that once he retired, everything would go back to normal. And so Lucas's story begins here. It starts with that unshakable belief and with a small, seemingly insignificant event that would completely change the way he looked at his future. Would the perfect picture he had painted for himself actually exist? Would he realize in time that life doesn't always follow a pre-written plan? Life had settled into a comfortable, predictable rhythm for Lucas. After a long day of meetings and paperwork, his evenings were his sanctuary. He'd pour himself a single glass of whiskey, sink into his worn-out leather armchair, and flip through his tablet, catching up on the headlines and maybe watching a little baseball. This particular Tuesday was no different. He scrolled past the usual political updates and local news stories, his thumb moving almost on autopilot until it stopped. A headline from a global health organization jumped out at him, stark and clinical. He clicked on it, half interested, expecting the usual dry data about health trends, but what he found wasn't dry at all. It was a cold splash of reality, and it hit him right in the face. The report was about global life expectancy, and he quickly scanned it for his home country. He saw the numbers for overall life expectancy, which he already knew was somewhere in the high 70s. That was comforting, but then a subheading caught his eye: healthy life expectancy. He had never even considered such a metric before. As he read on, his breath caught in his throat. The number for the average American was a shockingly low 66.1 years. Lucas felt the floor drop out from under him. The whiskey glass in his hand felt suddenly heavy, and he had to set it down on the side table before his shaking hand could drop it. He reread the number, his mind refusing to accept it. 66.1. It was so specific, so precise. It wasn't some abstract statistic from a faraway land. It was a number that was just over 2 years away from him. A simple, terrifying calculation ran through his mind, one that shattered the perfect picture he'd held for so long. He was 64 now. He was planning to retire at 65. So according to this report, his so-called healthy life could be over just a little more than a year after he finally hung up his briefcase for good. The thought hit him like a physical blow. So just over a year after I retire, my health could go downhill, he muttered to the empty room. The phrase felt hollow, almost like a joke. The countless hours he'd spent daydreaming about a long, active retirement, about traveling, about learning to paint, about simply enjoying the peace and quiet without the constant hum of a computer, all of it felt like a fragile fantasy. This wasn't some distant possibility, it was a looming, almost certain eventuality. The report wasn't just data, it was a personal threat, a wake-up call screaming at him from the glowing screen. All this time, he'd assumed that reaching 65 meant he'd be free and healthy for years and years. Now, this one brutal number suggested his freedom might be little more than a fleeting moment. The shock turned his entire body rigid, the warm evening air suddenly feeling cold. He stared at the screen, the number 66.1 burning itself into his mind. It was impossible, it had to be. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just been told the truth, and the truth was far scarier than he had ever imagined. This newfound, gut-wrenching awareness made him look up from his tablet. For the first time, he began to truly see the world around him through a different lens. He saw not a future of endless, healthy years, but a race against a ticking clock. A quiet dread began to settle in, a feeling that would soon compel him to do something he hadn't done in a very long time, to really, truly look at the people around him. The chilling number from the WHO report had opened Lucas's eyes, not just to a distant statistical truth, but to the living, breathing reality right in front of him. With the shock still fresh, he started to look at his friends and colleagues, the very people he had measured his own life against, in a completely different light. It was as if he had been walking around with blinders on and they had just been ripped away. He saw what he had been too complacent to notice before, and the picture was a mosaic of two starkly contrasting realities. There were the friends who had decided to retire early. He thought of Bill from accounting, who had left the company 5 years ago, right when he hit 60. At the time, Lucas remembered thinking Bill was crazy for giving up a perfectly good salary and benefits package. But now he saw Bill's life as a vibrant, colorful adventure. Bill was always posting pictures on social media. One week, he was hiking through a national park with his wife. The next, he was proudly showing off a new koi pond he'd built in his backyard. Lucas had just seen him at the grocery store the other day, looking younger and more energetic than he had in years, laughing as he talked about his latest volunteer gig at a local shelter. Lucas also thought of Martha, who had retired at 58 to take care of her grandchildren. She had traded her power suits for comfortable gardening clothes, her briefcase for a trowel. Her hands, once busy typing on a keyboard, were now caked in rich soil as she grew her own vegetables. She was healthy, vibrant, and most importantly, looked truly happy and at peace. These people were living proof that his own formula might be flawed. They had jumped off the treadmill and were thriving. Then there was the other group, the ones who, just like him, had held on to the idea of working until the bitter end. He thought of Jim, a friend from his team who had retired just last year. Lucas remembered the day of Jim's retirement party. Jim had been pale and frail, leaning heavily on a cane, his usual booming voice reduced to a hoarse whisper. Everyone had said he was just tired from the long hours. But just a few months later, Lucas heard through the grapevine that Jim was in and out of the hospital with a series of complications. He never got to take that cross-country road trip he had planned for decades. Then there was Mr. Henderson from upstairs, who had retired with a gold watch and a standing ovation, only to pass away a few weeks later. Lucas had seen him in the elevator just a month before, looking old, worn out, and utterly exhausted. The image was now a haunting ghost in his mind. With this new, painful clarity, Lucas saw a clear and undeniable pattern. The narrator's voice in his head, a voice that had always been his own, now seemed to whisper a profound truth, the clear opposition between the ones who retired early and are healthy and the ones who retired late and became sick. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a choice to either prioritize well-being and freedom or to sacrifice it all in a blind pursuit of a deadline. Lucas felt a deep, uncomfortable unease. He had been so focused on the finish line that he hadn't noticed that many had already crossed it and were now living full, beautiful lives, while others had collapsed right at the end. The contrast was no longer just a thought. It was a terrifying, tangible reality that made him question everything he had ever believed about his own path. The comfortable narrative he had constructed for himself was now crumbling, replaced by a sense of urgency he had never felt before. The quiet dread that had settled in Lucas's chest lingered for days, a constant, nagging whisper that his life's plan was built on a faulty foundation. He found himself restless, unable to focus at work. His usual lunch break routine of eating a sandwich at his desk and scrolling through news was replaced by aimless walks around the city block. It was on one of these walks, just as he was about to turn back toward the office, that he spotted a familiar face at a cafe's outdoor table. It was Alan, an old college friend he hadn't seen in over 2 decades. Alan had been an aspiring musician back then, a free spirit who had later found his footing as a financial advisor. He looked happy, relaxed, and unlike Lucas, not a day older than the last time they'd met. "Lucas, is that really you?" Alan called out, a wide grin spreading across his face. Lucas walked over, a mix of surprise and relief washing over him. They sat for an hour, talking about everything and nothing. Lucas found himself slowly opening up, confiding in his old friend about the WHO report and the unsettling observations he had been making about his retired colleagues. He spoke of the fear that his years of hard work might only lead to a life of illness, not leisure. Alan listened patiently, nodding. He had a knowing look in his eyes, as if he had heard this exact story 100 times before. When Lucas finished, Alan leaned forward and put a hand on his shoulder. His voice was gentle but firm, carrying the weight of experience. "Lucas, I'm going to tell you the 3 principles that have guided my life. They're not about getting rich, they're about living well. The first, he explained, was to spend less than you earn and invest the rest. Alan wasn't talking about being a miser, he was talking about being intentional. It's about making your money work for you so you don't have to work forever for it, he said. The second principle was just as simple: one house is enough. You don't need a mansion or a dozen properties to feel secure. A home is for living, not a status symbol. The less you have to maintain, the more time you have to live. And finally, he spoke about the most important principle of all: find a life partner to walk alongside you. Someone to share the good days with and someone to lean on during the bad ones. That, my friend, is true wealth. Alan's words hung in the air, but what he said next truly struck Lucas to the core. Alan looked him dead in the eye, his gaze unwavering. Health is more important than wealth, Lucas. If you wait until 65 to retire, you might have already lost your golden opportunity to truly live. He wasn't talking about money anymore. He was talking about time, the one currency you can never get back. Lucas had been so focused on accumulating a retirement fund, he'd forgotten to invest in the most valuable asset of all, his own well-being. The conversation wasn't just a friendly chat, it was a profound reckoning. It was the moment Lucas realized he had been running a race toward a finish line he might not be healthy enough to cross. The advice wasn't complex, but its simplicity was powerful enough to change everything. Alan's words had been a lightning bolt, a sudden and profound shock that jolted Lucas out of his long-held trance. The conversation didn't just give him advice, it gave him an entirely new lens through which to view his life. The very next day, the familiar routine felt different. The coffee from the office machine tasted stale. The numbers on his spreadsheet seemed meaningless. He was no longer just ticking off boxes until 65. He was acutely aware of a new clock, a much more urgent one, ticking down the precious, healthy weeks he had left. The fear of ending up like Jim or Mr. Henderson was a powerful motivator, a constant reminder that he had to change course and fast. His first step was small, but it felt monumental. That night, instead of his usual microwave dinner, he found himself in the kitchen, chopping fresh vegetables and grilling a piece of fish. It tasted different, vibrant, clean, and full of life. It was a simple meal, but it felt like a rebellion against the years of fast food and convenience. He also started taking walks during his lunch break, not aimless ones like before, but purposeful strides through the nearby park. He felt the sun on his face, the crisp air in his lungs. He even began to incorporate light workouts into his routine, starting with a half hour at the gym a few times a week, feeling the satisfying burn of muscles he hadn't used in years. But the biggest change wasn't physical, it was mental. Lucas began to actively question everything. He found himself spending his evenings poring over books and websites about personal finance. He started building a new kind of spreadsheet, one not about his retirement at 65, but about an earlier one. He researched different investment strategies, calculated his net worth, and created a budget that was less about deprivation and more about intention. He saw his money not just as a number in a bank account, but as a tool for freedom. The old Lucas would have thought of this as a chore, but this new version of himself was filled with a sense of urgency and purpose he hadn't felt since his 20s. He was no longer just waiting for a future to arrive, he was actively building it, piece by piece. The narrator can now show how Lucas's journey had become a race against time, but a hopeful one. He was not just trying to beat the clock, he was trying to reclaim the weeks and months he had taken for granted. He became keenly aware of every choice he made, from the food he ate to the time he spent on hobbies. The shift in his perception was palpable. The anxiety he had felt after reading the report transformed into a focused, determined energy. He was no longer defined by his office job and his retirement date. He was defined by the choices he was making right now, in the present, to ensure that his future was filled with life, not just with money. This new sense of purpose made the world around him feel more vibrant, more real. He was finally truly waking up. The story of Lucas could have ended with him staring at a screen, paralyzed by fear. But a narrator's job is to show not just a moment of crisis, but the arc of a life. And in Lucas's case, that arc was bending toward a brighter future. He didn't quit his job the next day, of course. The financial realities of his life were still very much in place. But he started to live differently, not with a sense of dread, but with a new sense of purpose and urgency. He began his days with a brisk walk, not a panicked rush to the office. His lunches were now filled with fresh, healthy food instead of fast food wrappers. He was a student again, but this time, the subject was his own life, and the lessons were all about living it to the fullest. The passing of time, which he once saw as a slow, steady march toward a finish line, was now a precious commodity. Each day, each week, each month was an opportunity, not just another line item on a spreadsheet. He worked with a renewed sense of energy, but the anxiety was gone, replaced by a calm determination. He was still Lucas, the man who worked in an office, but he was also a man who was now actively planning his escape to a life of health and happiness. The final scene of his story finds him on a quiet afternoon, a few years after his revelation. He's no longer in that cramped office. He's sitting on the porch of his cozy home, looking out at a small garden he's carefully tended. The sun is warm on his face, and a gentle breeze rustles the leaves of the trees. He's not waiting for a specific date on a calendar anymore. He's living. In his hand, he holds an old, worn notebook. He looks down at it and sees the scrawled, hopeful note he had written years ago. 1,000 healthy weeks left to enjoy. I have to live fully. He smiles to himself. The number isn't a source of fear anymore. It's a testament to the life he reclaimed. The story of Lucas is our story too. It's a quiet reminder that the finish line isn't a number, a job title, or a specific date. The true victory is not about waiting to retire, but about making sure you are still healthy enough to live when you get there.